Hello and welcome to the Gifted Ed podcast. I am your host, Megan McCarthy, clinical social worker. We are grateful for the opportunity to share this space with you today as we talk about the complexities of giftedness. This episode is a continuation of our discussion about the SEL challenges gifted students face with Abby Spiwak and Kari Zweber Palmer as they discuss how to best implement strategies to support SEL needs of our gifted learners. By the end of this episode, you will have a better understanding of how to use the curriculum to meet the developmental and the social-emotional needs of your students. You'll have a better understanding of how to look at behavior as communication versus something that is good or bad. And lastly, you will have tools to support your students independently using these strategies. Welcome to the Gifted Ed podcast, Abby and Kari.
I know the SuperFlex curriculum can be goofy, can be silly, right? Which is a benefit of it. It's partially why I was drawn to it. But when talking through these tough topics, how do you recommend transitioning that conversation as students age, or when students are very literal, as many of our gifted students can be?
Yeah, well, let's tackle both parts of that really great question. I think in terms of how do you grow it up, how do you age it up, I love that you asked that because that's core to the philosophy behind this teaching. When students learn about the unthinkabots like rock brain, for example, maybe when they're in your third grade classroom, and then a year or two passes by and they're getting older, it definitely has been our experience that sometimes they don't want to talk about rock brain anymore. They did that. They're ready to move on from it. So what we're trying to keep in mind is that we want to keep the concept, but adjust the context. So rock brain is really all about flexible and stuck thinking. It might be that we start to ask them more. Well, how would you draw that character? What does it look like to you? And using their own ideas and motivations and preferences to take that idea of stuck and flexible thinking and make it into an entirely new unthinkabot. Or we just drop the bot talk and start talking more about, hey, rock brain was a vehicle for us to learn more about flexible thinking. What else can we do and talk through with that? When it comes to the students that are a little bit more literal, as you talked about, we want to be thoughtful. As we've mentioned, the ideas are abstract, but I find when we center the learning on our students' experiences, that can be a good way to begin. So we're going to start by looking for examples of stuck thinking in their own world. What are the life experiences they're having with times where it's hard to be flexible? What are the books you're reading in school? What's in your curriculum? When do characters have a hard time with stuck and flexible thinking, or in our free time with shows or movies we watch? So we are really trying to figure out how we can make the concept of stuck thinking more tangible. And we might start there and then add in the bots and the characters and the imagination around it if students are having a hard time with it being a little bit too abstract to begin with.
Yeah, those are awesome strategies. I love that you mentioned the piece of connecting it to something that they know, right? And how powerful for them to connect these characters to characters in shows, characters that they're reading about. Like this character in reading definitely has those worry bots in their brain, you know? And I think having them apply that to not just themselves, but to other people and people around them can be so powerful and impactful too.
And I'll see that more in the middle school setting, less talk of bots and that, but just the stuck and flexible thinking within the literature, you know, different characters, because they're really diving deep in the character development and interactions between characters in the literature. So I have seen that kind of just play out, and they naturally make it their own. If it meant something to them early on, then they kind of naturally make it their own as they age too.
I have a funny example. This was a little bit younger, but I had a fourth grader doing a book report on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And in the book report, they wrote about how rock brain seemed to get into the characters the brains of all the characters and made them follow their own plan and get stuck, which is the plot of the book. So being able to really, again, understand that tie between academic and social is important here, that we can use our curriculum to come up with these examples that are going to help us identify character traits. So we're building reading comprehension and we're really tackling what we traditionally think of as more academic, but it's also helping with the learning process and our social relationships because flexible thinking is central to those as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the movie Inside Out, right?
Yeah.
The Disney movie, right? It's talking about pretty real emotions and pretty big things that happen in kids' development, but it's doing it with these fun and silly way of in their brain. All these characters are wanting to work together or take control, right? And so it's a very similar concept, except I think those characters in SuperFlex are such behaviors that I think we see in the classroom and we want to help students develop. And so that's what I've loved about it is, right, destroyer of fun. This character cheats in games.
Yep.
A glass man has explosions, big reactions to small things. And those are those skills we want to help our kids develop at this age. And so by giving them a character, you're doing it in a way where it's not a bad behavior or a bad student. It's just something that a strategy that we need to learn and develop. One of the big things I've noticed as I'm implementing the curriculum is that it is a rich and amazing resource, but we have time constraints.
Yep.
I wish we didn't, but we do.
Yep.
So how do you recommend streamlining the implementation of the lessons? I know something as I've implemented it, there's a lot of jargon. So things like unthinkabots, the bots, the characters, there's a lot of different things. And how do you streamline that to really have the biggest impact with your students?
Yeah, that's such a real question. And I so appreciate that because there's so many things you're trying to do in any given day. And it is potentially possible that when you pop open SuperFlex, you just get overwhelmed by just the amount of pieces to it. So I think first off, just acknowledging, there's a learning curve with some of this is important, but it really is thoughtfully designed to try to guide you through it. So one of the very first lessons is to read a comic book, and all of the essential components of the story and the strategies, they're kind of contained in that comic. So being able to read that with your students is a good entry point to it. And also understanding that it is made to be modified to fit your needs as well. So when you're first learning it, you might kind of stick to the script almost. There are PowerPoints that go with it that are meant to give you different language. So you're not on your own trying to figure it out, but just kind of reading it and learning it alongside of them. And taking it as a gradual process, I think, is really key to this. You don't need to know it all at once. You don't need to be responsible for learning all of the components from day one. You want to have a good idea of where you're going and why you're doing it. But I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier. It does provide opportunities to model your own learning and say, this is a new curriculum for me. I'm getting a little bit of that worry wall and think about here because I'm not quite sure how this is going to go. Let's figure this out together. So being able to use your own mistakes or just process and learning can be helpful to model in some way. And then, of course, the strategies that go with it. What are the strategies I might use to defeat worry wall here as we learn this together? So being able to just take it one step at a time and not fast forward to understanding everything at once, I think tends to be helpful.
No, that's great. I love the idea of modeling that, right? We talked about that in the beginning of modeling the flexible thinking. And I think you can even do that when you're teaching something new, right? And teaching a new curriculum. One of the big things as I've implemented the program is that I've been curious about is how to connect with parents with it. How do you have any tips, Kari, for connecting maybe other teachers or our parents with the vocabulary of the program? This way, families can take the essential components home and help with reinforcement too.
Yeah. I think the best tip I have for families is to model our own problem solving that we're doing. What we often don't realize is how much internal thinking we do when we're trying to solve any kind of problem in the social world. So to make that come out loud and be a conversation is really a great place to get started. We don't want to try to make families feel like they have to know it all and know what these bots are and the strategies and everything. So I think it can be a collaborative learning experience. So for example, let's say that you as the parent or adults have a situation in your day and you come home and you tell your student, I was going to a doctor appointment today And when I went to grab my purse, I knocked coffee all over myself, which may or may not have happened to me last week. But just talking about those like everyday occurrences. And if you're familiar with the language, so maybe teachers have shared with you and your child is coming home and they have some learning they're sharing with you, you might be able to say something like, wow, when I knocked that coffee all over, the unthinkable glass man really tried to take over the power of my flexible thinking. I was having big feelings. I kind of wanted to just yell and just get too over-focused on that problem. But my goal was to make it to the appointment on time, so I had to take a deep breath. I needed to use a strategy of talking to myself. I know I can solve this problem. And I really had to work through defeating that unthinkable today. So if you can do that, great, but let's be more realistic. If you can't and you don't know that, and you're even laughing as you listen to me say that, will I ever be able to do it? Yes, with time, it's a process. But take that same scenario, and as a parent, you're unfamiliar, you tell that story, and then ask your student who's been learning about perhaps SuperFlex in school and say, hey, which unthinkable was challenging my flexible thinking? And then they might be able to go, oh, that sounds a lot like Glass Man, or maybe that was Rock Brain. So they're filling in the knowledge gaps that you have, but then they're able to think a little bit more critically about it. So it makes for a really nice dynamic. I guess if I were to summarize that long answer, I'd say share stories with each other. Share stories from your day about things you've navigated. And it doesn't just have to be the negative stuff, but the positive stuff too, and how you might have used a strategy, or maybe you needed to ask for help or support. And then put in the language of SuperFlex within those story sharing time.
And I would say, just as I'm listening, either as a social worker or as a parent, any storytelling, I guess I'm thinking more now with my parent lens, where I have kind of walked through just slowing down the story to insert, let's think about this, like insert opportunities for them to be like, oh, well, what was the other person thinking? I feel like that, whether you know the language, don't know the language, or you get the vocabulary or don't, I feel like the kids can insert vocab, right, if they're learning about it at school, and they can teach you, which could be a cool opportunity right there in and of itself. But I feel like just slowing down reaction time to insert different thoughts and different processes and different emotions of whatever went around, I feel like that alone is huge in all of this.
Well, and I love that you mentioned, parents can pick up on the language, because I've even noticed too, in my classroom, students are using the language with each other, right? So even today in math, some students were working on their devices using a program that we use in math. And, all right, guys, it's time to transition. A couple people had some trouble closing our devices on time. And, students were like, brain eater, don't let brain eater into your brain. Those distractobots are invading your brain. And so they're using that language with each other to help each other. And so they're going to be able to take that home and use that language at home too.
Yeah. As much as we look at the curriculum and see all the pieces that are there for us as the adults to learn and support, it is just the essence of that is exactly contained in your story right there. They're going to get the understanding. And then once we start to hear them use it with each other, you do find that it's easier to kind of take to different environments and have conversations there.
Yeah. And I think, Kari, my last question I have for you is just, do you have any tips to help students supporting the use of those strategies independently? I think oftentimes in SEL, we're giving them these strategies, we're practicing these strategies, we're encouraging them, but really the goal is that it eventually becomes independent and they use it on their own. And I'm just curious if you have any tips to help them develop that independent use of their strategies.
Yeah, that's like the thing we're all seeking, right? How do we get these strategies to feel more ingrained and intuitive for our students? So I think, you have to begin to acknowledge, as you did so well, that self-awareness comes before behavior change. So there can be a really long journey between knowing and then being able to use a strategy to do something about it. Two different processes. But I think to your question, when that time arrives and they do have that awareness and they are aware they're needing to use a strategy, how do we help them practice that a little bit more independently? So a couple of things to kind of consider. I like to find times where we are making time for practice and reflection. So, for example, we were going to do a board game with one of my groups, and we had been talking about the strategies for a really long time. So again, students had that base, but we got a board game out, and I said, okay, we're going to play this game. But before we begin, I want you to think about one bot that might challenge you. Think about when we've played games before. Who tries to appear and take over the power of our flexible thinking? And then what's your one strategy you're going to practice? So sometimes we have a little discussion about it. Sometimes they jot it down on a piece of paper. But I want them to focus on not everything all at once, but just one strategy. We then begin to play the game. But then as the teacher in this scenario, I'm stopping them to pause and reflect in different increments. Sometimes it's like 2 minutes. I'm not talking about an hour-long game or a half hour, but we might practice for 2 to 3 minutes. And then I do a lot of pause. My students are really used to hearing me say pause, not stop. Sometimes the language of stop gets our emotions riled up, but pause, check in. How is it going? Have you noticed any bots? Have you used any strategies? So I'm building intentional times for us to practice the use of that strategy, but not requiring students to do it for a long amount of time. And I find that when we create those moments, it helps with the more independent use of the strategy. So for example, in the classroom, you could do something pretty similar. It's about to be independent reading time. Take a look at all the different bots that we've talked about. It's helpful to have visual supports when you do this teaching. So if you have things posted in your classroom or kids have little pictures of the UnthinkAbots, take a look. Which one might come up during independent reading? And now let's choose a strategy. So then you're going to have independent reading time start, but you'll pause that process. Because again, the goal is really the practical use of strategy.
I think the two powerful pieces that I just heard that I think they're obvious, but then they're not, right? It's usually those are the biggest pieces when we're looking into practice, is that students need to be aware. We all do, right? Before we can implement any independent strategy. And so oftentimes we'll say they have the strategy, just use them. And it's like there are a million steps before we can pick a strategy that works for us, practice it, not in the setting that it's required, but in the practice setting, right? Where it's safe, like we've talked about before.
Yep.
So just kind of the breaking that down into all the steps that are required. And then I think just the pause, right? Like whether that's the teachers or parents talking through scenarios that they've experienced, kids taking a pause to realize there's other perspectives at play here. That pause button is just enormous. Mm-hmm. Kari and Abby, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciated this conversation and kind of look at this neat little world of how SuperFlex really impacts the SEL needs of gifted learners. So thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. It's been fun.
We want to thank you for joining us in this space today. Please subscribe to the Gifted Ed podcast to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Stay tuned for our next episode that continues to unpack the complexities of giftedness.